Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and this week I am back with the third and final installment of all of the quilts from my book, How Do I Quilt It? Now, if you missed the other two videos, make sure you go back and take a look at those. In my book, I feature 9 beautiful quilts, and it includes 3 patterns quilted 3 different ways. For this week, I'm going to be talking about the Pinwheel Tessellation quilt, and I'm going to show you 3 different versions of this quilt. One quilted completely with a walking foot or dual feed system, one quilted with a very simple edge-to-edge design, and then the final one custom quilted using both walking foot and free motion techniques. In my book, I have dozens of different ideas on how you can quilt your quilts along with quilting plans that you can mix and match. You can take the techniques in this book and you can apply them to any quilt in your UFO pile. So for this first version of Pinwheel Tessellation, it's super scrappy, it's super busy. My #1 tip when making a very busy quilt is to quilt it with a very simple design that's easy to execute yet provides texture. Something that's going to blend into the quilt and allow you to get that quilt done quickly. For this quilt, I've done a wavy line design, which is literally one of the easiest designs that you can do. So let's dive in and I will talk to you more in depth about how I quilted this quilt. For the scrappy version of my tessellated pinwheels quilt, I chose a bunch of my bright, colorful fabrics from a bunch of my different collections and cut them all and organized them by colorway. Then I laid out all of the pieces on my design wall before sewing them together so I could get the color placement that I wanted. The walking foot quilting plan I'm going to do is a simple wavy line grid, and here's what my sewing machine setup looks like. I'm increasing the stitch length to 3.0 and I'm decreasing the top tension. This gives me a stitch that I like. I'm also lowering my presser foot pressure to 0, which is going to help the stitching glide across the quilt. And finally, I'm practicing a simple wavy line design on a scrap fabric and scrap batting, just so I can make sure that those settings look good before quilting the actual quilt. Here's an overhead shot of the first anchor quilting that I'm doing on the quilt. Wavy line quilting across the major seam lines in both directions. Once I've done that, I'm going to subdivide the quilting and eyeball a line that's about halfway in between my anchor quilting lines. I'm going to work my way from right to left across the quilt. Now, because this design is quilted on the diagonal, I've actually rotated the quilt 45 degrees so that from my perspective, I'm still stitching from the top to the bottom, even though the quilt is rotated. I'm using the dual feed on my machine with the 20D foot so I can really see what I'm doing. This basically acts the same way as a walking foot, but it gives me a little bit more flexibility. Now I'm wearing quilting gloves that are going to help me push the quilt underneath the machine, and I'm quilting 1 row at a time. I'm stitching a line all the way across my quilt, cutting thread, and then moving the quilt over slightly so that I can quilt the next line. Again, the idea is that I'm working from right to left all the way across my quilt, 1 stitching line at a time. You can see a lot of the detail that I've done. So my lines first start off 2 inches wide, and now I'm going through and I'm quilting them so that they are about 1 inch wide. Now on a previous video, I've shown you how to do this grid using straight lines, but on this particular quilt, I'm quilting wavy lines. Both quilting plans are included in the book, and you can mix and match the plans depending on the look you want for your particular quilt. So again, another line and another line, I cut thread in between, I pull the quilt up and I just continue stitching. I'm not marking, I'm not making my wavy line look like any other wavy line. I'm just enjoying the texture created by these wavy lines. You'll notice as I quilt that I'm moving the quilt a lot more than I'm actually stitching. So my process is stitch until I feel like I'm starting to reach, stop with the needle in the down position, shift and move my hand so I feel comfortable, and continue stitching that wavy line from the top to the bottom. You'll see as I'm moving my way from right to left across the quilting on the right hand side of the quilt is more dense, and the quilting on the left hand side of the quilt is less dense. I'm scrunching and smushing the quilt underneath the machine, continuing to divide and conquer the process. Now I'm going to stitch this way in both directions. So I start off with a 2-inch wide grid in both directions, and then I get down to a 1-inch wide grid in both directions. I could make the grid larger if I wanted to. I could make the grid smaller if I wanted to. That's going to be just a personal preference, but it's the same wavy line. Probably the hardest thing to do is dealing with the bulk of the quilt under the machine. So having a very large throat space really helps, as well as a drop-in table that holds most of the weight of the quilt. As I get to the end of this line of stitching, I'm going to rotate the quilt. And now you can see that it's more dense on my left-hand side and less dense on my right-hand side. So working my way across the quilt methodically from right to middle, rotating the quilt, and then from middle to the right, it helps me systematically quilt the density of the quilt even, and it's easier to deal with the bulk this way. Now, I know some people might say, why aren't you starting quilting in the middle of your quilt? You absolutely can do that if you prefer, but for me, I like the idea of working right to center, rotating, and center back to the right. It's methodical, it's easy, it works great every time. And as you can see, I'm adding more and more texture with each line of quilting that I'm stitching. It's very fun, it's very textural, it's very simple, and it doesn't actually use that much thread. In fact, I was able to quilt this whole quilt using the same thread in the top and bobbin, and it was less than 1 spool of thread. So it's a really quick and easy way. Now I'm just about done with the quilting, and it's going to be this really yummy wavy line grid all the way across the entire quilt. Again, just to recap, I'm quilting wavy lines in both directions 2 inches apart, and then I'm quilting wavy lines in both directions 1 inch apart. The main reason I do this divide and conquer process is so that I don't lock myself into a certain size grid. Maybe I'm thinking that I want my lines to be 1/4 inch apart, but in reality, they end up being 1 inch apart. If I try to stitch very dense lines in the beginning, I've locked myself into how much I need to quilt. But if I do my lines 2 inches apart and then 1 inch apart, that gives me the flexibility to change the density at any time. Here's a final close-up of what this looks like stitching in the other direction. Again, my lines are about 1 inch apart. Now they're not perfectly even, they're not perfectly spaced. I haven't used any marking at all. It's just been fun, easy, and carefree. For my second version of Pinwheel Tessellation, I've done something completely different. Rather than making a scrappy looking quilt, this quilt uses only 3 colors, a red, white, and blue, to create a sort of modern Americana look. Now, to tie in with this modern Americana look, I wanted to quilt it with a red, white, and blue variegated thread, and the quilting pattern is called Crackle. So it kind of evokes that like 4th of July type of theme. However, if you wanted to go in a different direction, you could pick fabrics and quilting designs to match. Now, for this particular quilt, I've done an edge-to-edge all-over design with free motion. I call it a meandering design because no matter what the actual design of the quilting is, the quilting motif, you can meander, which means going back and forth and up and down in all different directions from edge to edge across the quilt. So whether you like to do a stipple or a crackle or a swirl or any type of free motion design, you start on one end of the quilt, you work your way block by block very methodically to the other edge of the quilt. Now, the way that I particularly do this on my machine is I start on the right-hand side of the quilt, I move my way towards the center block by block, and then when the quilt gets too bulky under the machine, I rotate it 180 degrees, and then I go back the same way that I came. So methodically, I'm working my way across the quilt, and by doing edge to edge, it helps me deal with the bulk a whole lot better. Now, when it comes to free motion, my #1 tip is pick one design and quilt it all the way across your quilt. By the time you're finished with that quilt, you're going to be an expert in that design. Another really good tip and another great reason to use an edge-to-edge free motion design is if your quilting is less than perfect. You can hide a whole lot of imperfect seams by meandering your way to and fro and not causing attention to those mismatched seams. So I love to share lots of tips and tricks for hiding your imperfections in my book, How Do I Quilt It? Now let's take a closer look at this version of Pinwheel Tessellation. I knew I wanted to quilt my crackle design for the all-over free motion design, so I drew it out on 2 different versions of the quilt. When I ultimately decided to go with the red, white, and blue color scheme for this quilt, I chose a variegated red, white, and blue thread to match. I really love the texture that it gives in the blue areas, and I love how it really blends into the red and white areas. This is a really kind of fun and crazy design that looks great no matter how you stitch it. So my basic process when machine quilting is to first draw out a quilting plan or sketch the design on paper. Then I'm going to practice that same quilting plan on either a scrap of fabric or a quilt block. And finally, I will do that on the regular quilt. Doing this process allows me to get a feel for the flow of the design and to help me decide how easy or time-consuming it is to stitch out the design. To go along with the machine quilting, I also wanted to machine bind using that same thread. So I stitched a couple of straight line designs using my regular foot on my sewing machine and the built-in dual feed. So I'm stitching 2 straight lines next to each other. It's a design that I've done on other quilts, and it's a really easy and fast way to finish the binding by machine. So you're going to put the binding on your quilt like you normally would, and you can either fold the binding to the front of the quilt or to the back. I folded it to the front, stitched 1 straight line with the variegated thread, put my needle near the edge of the binding and my foot next to the previously stitched line, and created 2 lines of straight stitching. It kind of really blended in nicely with the straight linear crackle design and added a really fun element to the quilt. So this is a really great choice for quilts that are going to get a lot of wear and tear on them. Now let's talk about the third version of my Pinwheel Tessellation quilt. With this quilt, I really wanted to show off the different light and dark fabrics. In this particular layout, how I've done the quilt, it's the same exact pattern as the other 2, but when I laid out the arrangement of fabrics, I alternated every other row, so that one column was colorful prints and then the next column was lighter backgrounds, and they varied that every other row. To call out attention to that, I made sure to quilt every column with a different quilting design. It's kind of what I call a machine quilting sampler. So when I machine quilted this, I did all of the walking foot quilting first to anchor and secure the quilt. I basically stitched in the ditch between the rows, and then I added all the decorative free motion work. So the walking foot straight line ditch quilting is kind of what holds everything together, and you don't really see that quilting. Then you fill in the gaps with the free motion quilting, which is really the jazz of the quilt. So it's a really fun way to quilt. I include a complete quilting plan, and in just a minute you'll see some of the details of the machine quilting motifs that I chose. Here's my first rough drawing, and then I chose to use my Good Vibes fabric collection because it is separated into half light and half darks. This version of tessellated pinwheels has a light and a dark pinwheel every other block. It's a slightly different look, and it was really fun to play around with the machine quilting designs. For this quilt, I did my spray basting method, but I used a table to show that you don't have to use a design wall. Now, with each of the quilting designs, I practice them on a practice block first. I've got some straight lines, I've got some echoed lines, and I've got some really fun free motion designs like pebbles, and another favorite is wiggly lines that I call switchbacks. I also used 3 designs that were very similar to ribbon candy, but all with slight modifications. And I also used my chevrons design, but I quilted the chevrons with more or less straight lines. I also quilted some zigzags and finally jagged stipple, which is one of my favorite designs. So once I had practiced all of these designs, I put them together into one quilting plan. But no matter which quilting plan I choose, I'm always quilting the quilt starting on the right-hand side, working my way towards the center, rotating the quilt, and then working my way from the center back out. The secret is if you baste your quilt really well, you can actually start quilting on the quilt anywhere you like. And doing my process of divide and conquer, anchor quilting, that's going to secure your quilt in certain key places so that you can decide at any time where you want to quilt, what you want to quilt, and how densely you want to quilt your quilt. I quilted it with a golden yellow thread that blended into all the colors. Now, before I even began the free motion quilting, I started by stitching in the ditch around each of the rows. This is the only video I have showing me quilting this quilt, but you get an idea of how it's going to look filling in between each of the blocks. You can see on the back side what it looked like after I had stitched in the ditch and then echoed around the outside ditch. This is the anchor quilting that's going to hold it all together. And I'm showing how to tie off the knots if you need to bury your threads. Now you can see a close-up of each of the free motion designs that I did in each row. There's my zigzags along with some of my switchbacks, and you can see pebbles in the corners. There's more of the switchbacks in detail. And there are my jagged stipple with some of my crazy 8 designs. You can see some of the crazy 8s plus the chevrons in this little video. And finally, there's a close-up of the chevrons plus some of the little loopy L's that you can see off in the distance. It was really fun to try out a whole bunch of different designs on this quilt. Mix and match your favorites and practice however you'd like to. I wanted to wrap up with a final quilting tip and show you the backing of my custom quilted pinwheel tessellation quilt. Now, when you want your quilting to show, make sure that you use a solid color or a light or a tone-on-tone fabric for the backing, and you can quilt with a slightly contrasting thread. Conversely, if you want to hide your imperfections, use a busy back and matching threads. For this custom quilted quilt, I really had fun quilting all of the different designs. And no matter which style of quilting you do, walking foot, free motion, or both, I teach you all my tips and tricks, plus all of my recommended tools in my book, How Do I Quilt It? Just remember, it has 3 step-by-step pieced patterns, 9 different quilting plans, gorgeous finished quilts and samples for you to follow, and dozens of machine quilting possibilities. Take a look at the links in the comment box below so that you can see all 3 videos showing all 9 of the quilts with their quilting plans. And I'll also put information on where you can get a copy of my book, How Do I Quilt It? Just remember, I want to be your quilting cheerleader and help you out every step of the way. Leave me any comments or questions that you have, and I'm happy to get back with you so that you can enjoy machine quilting as much as I do. Until next time, happy quilting!